You're listening to Adapt or Die, the podcast that explores transformation, the pace of change, and how enterprises are working to make smarter, faster decisions across their extended supply chain. Today, I'd like to welcome back Dr. Madhav Durbha to the show. Madhav, it's great to have you.
Great to be on the show, Matt.
Excellent. So in the past, we've talked a lot about technology and the inner workings between systems. Today, I want to explore something that is happening right now and has been very much in the news and has a very distinct effect on the supply chain. And that is coronavirus. Now, I've been reading the stories, and it's become a massive epidemic that started in Wuhan, China, but has spread across the region and even to other parts of the world. And as people have been quarantined or as they've been sick, it's also caused a slowdown. And that seems to have an effect on the supply chain. I guess my question to you, Madhav, is how big of a deal is this for supply chains? What are some of the things that you're hearing from the companies that you're working with?
Yeah, it's a top of mind issue for a lot of our customers, Matt, and it's a very big deal. So China accounts for 16% of the world GDP right now. So just as a basis of comparison, if you compare the current coronavirus outbreak to SARS outbreak in 2003, at that time, China only accounted for 4% of the world GDP. So that's a fourfold increase just on percentage terms, right? Now we're at 16% of the world GDP coming out of China. Also, China is a major power, both on the demand and on the supply side as well. Chinese consumer, as such, has become a major focus for a lot of large global brands. So on the supply side, if you think about it, China now accounts for about fifth of the global mineral imports and the minerals that China processes into various materials and various products that get manufactured there. So the dependency, if you look at it both from demand and supply perspective on China, is very, very high. And now coming to your question about what does it mean for our customers? Just yesterday, I was talking to one of our customers, and they right now have very strict travel restrictions and freezes in terms of travel to in and out of China. So they are, as we speak, they're working through business continuity and how do they kind of bypass China, if you will, from sources of supply and look at alternate sources of supply. This is just one company, but same sentiment is being reflected in all my recent conversations with my customers.
That's really interesting, and not only in terms of the GDP growth for China itself, but yes, I mean, it's become such an intrinsic part of the supply chain. This past year or so, there's been so much talk about trade wars, escalating tariffs, causing companies to rethink things like nearshoring or reshoring some of their operations. I was under the impression that the dependency on China would have at least started to reduce, if not radically. Is that not actually the case?
That's a very interesting question. Here's how I would categorize it. If there's one thing that coronavirus is doing, it is exposing the huge dependency on China that still exists. In spite of all the trade wars, in spite of, frankly, there has been some increase in nearshoring activity, don't get me wrong, right? So nearshoring is picking up, but let's take an example, right? If you look at a typical car, it's got about 30,000 parts. So even if the final assembly is nearshored, there are still quite a few of components. If you break it down through the bill of material and look at each and every individual component that goes into a car, there are quite a few components where the China dependency is extremely high and China is a major supply source. So, and again, this is just one industry. I just wanted to cite that as an example.
Sure, no, that makes sense. And with something so complex, it's logical that with 30,000 components in a vehicle, that those separate tiers of suppliers still do have regional dependencies like that, even if, as you said, the manufacturing itself is done nearshored or in another location. What about not just automotive, but other industries? Do you have a sense of which industries are most impacted?
Sure. Uh, we work with a variety of customers in very different industry verticals. So, of all the industry verticals and the customers that we are interfacing with, specifically in the context of coronavirus, high-tech industry is the one that is most exposed to China. So other than being a source of inexpensive labor over the years, China has built a very formidable competence when it comes to high-tech manufacturing, and frankly has become a powerhouse, right? So especially you mentioned Wuhan as the epicenter of the outbreak for coronavirus. And that, in fact, happens to be a major hub for high-tech manufacturers. And besides being a major hub, there is also a big motor and waterway traffic that goes through the region, and that's getting impacted, and that's causing a lot of holdups in terms of supply. So definitely, high-tech is the one that bubbles to the top of my mind. But there are other industry verticals as well to talk about, right? So there is next in terms of the risk exposure is pharma. So if you think about pharma, China has emerged as a major market for pharmaceuticals, just given the population base there, but also has become a major supplier for active pharma ingredients, the ingredients that go into a lot of the medications that we all consume. India, over the years, has emerged as a great alternate source for active pharma ingredients. But the reality is that China still supplies a lot of key starting materials that in fact go into active pharma ingredients to India, and that eventually makes its way into lots of the active pharma ingredients. So what this translates to is about 70% of the active pharma ingredients are directly or indirectly kind of linked back to China. It goes back to your comment about having these multi-tiers in the supply chain, right? And if you think about the high-tech industry, the source switching there is difficult because of the competence and the huge capital investments that have gone into China. If you think about pharma industry, again, the source switching is not so trivial because the pharma industry is highly regulated in nature. And whenever you have newer sources, you need to make sure that they are certified by the authorities in the markets in which the drugs are marketed. So that's a major factor as well. So source switching is not going to be that trivial. And in the short term, pharma industry may be okay because they have, relatively speaking, they have higher levels of inventory as compared to other industries. But the disruption will eventually have ripple effects that will impact the industry as well. I mean, I'll cite you one interesting fact, right? If you think about ibuprofen, one of the most common drugs in the market, medications in the market. Did you know, Matt, that China accounts for 95% of the ibuprofen that's imported into the United States?
Wow. That's a staggering number. 95% of ibuprofen comes from China. And it does speak to that intertwined nature of the global supply chain. Are there other industries that you can think of as well that are feeling the effect or may have an effect down the road?
Absolutely. On par with pharma is, I would probably put automotive right up there in terms of the risk exposure. Over the recent past, if you look at the recent years, auto industry has gotten a bit more regionalized. It's partly because of the rapidly rising wages in China, a rise of automation, which is kind of leveling the playing field, if you will, when it comes to labor costs and things like that. And of course, not to forget the taxes and tariffs and the trade wars. So essentially, there were three hub and spoke models that emerged in the auto industry, with Mexico as the low-cost spoke for North America, and then Eastern Europe and Morocco for Western Europe as the spokes, and then China for Asia. But however, again, going back to the multi-tiered nature of this industry, if you get past the first tier or second tier, there are many components for which China is the primary source. Often it comes to parts that we don't even think of seriously, right? Such mundane parts like key fobs or USB charging ports or sun visors that can bring supply chain to a halt when those kind of components are out of supply. The production halts. And in fact, there are several automotive companies recently they announced line shutdowns because of shortage of parts from China. And the number of shutdowns is only increasing now because companies are running low on inventories and they don't have the essential parts to keep operating their production lines, and that's causing some impact with the automotive suppliers as well as automotive manufacturers.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just putting it into perspective, you often take for granted all the pieces that go into something like a vehicle. But certainly you can't sell it if it doesn't have safety features like the visors or a key to actually start the vehicle. So I imagine the effect is something that a lot of people don't typically understand. What about an industry that almost all of us, or probably everyone, interacts with, retail? You haven't mentioned that one yet. Would retailers be feeling the effect as well, thinking about how much of the items that they're selling originate from China?
Absolutely. Especially let's take luxury goods market as an example, right? And again, Chinese consumer emerged as a major player, right? And a lot of companies now have establishments in China, retail outlets, etc., the higher end brands. And that is on the demand side. And a lot of these stores have been shut down because of the coronavirus, are working through restricted hours. And as such, they are facing labor shortages in terms of filling the store shelves with the products, etc. But let's not forget, retail also has a major supply dependency on China. Even when you consider India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, these are all emerging as good alternate sources when it comes to, let's say, apparel. So relatively speaking, there are few more alternate sources of supply, if you will, compared to some of the other industries. But do keep in mind that even a lot of the fabric that goes into these factories in India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, these countries, a lot of the fabric still comes from China as well. So again, when you go into that multi-tier nature of the supply chain, the exposure is certainly there when you look at things like soft goods and fashion apparel and things like that because of the virus impact. So I would say they're not immune for sure.
Yeah, and you brought up some great points too. One, the rise of the middle class in China, so that's a big source of demand. But two, the intertwined nature of the supply chain, the multiple tiers of sources that all of these industries are depending on in order to keep running. So essentially, it sounds like the impact is fully across the board, and really not many industries are immune.
Yeah, that's a very fair statement, right? Because supply chains are supply chains. At the end of the day, when you take a supply chain to its source, traveling across the tiers, there is that intertwined nature with China still that's quite heavy.
So you alluded to this, but in your role with LlamaSoft, working on the industry strategy side, you do have a lot of direct connection to businesses across multiple industries. But even from your own analysis, how do you see organizations are responding to this particular disruption?
So the tactics are varying amongst the customers that we are working with, but there are some general themes that are emerging. So let me just go through them, right? As they come to my mind. The ones with very good handle on their suppliers were able to lock in the key components before they run out of supply. So it comes down to how quickly they were able to react, right? And this increased the days on hand inventory. So some of the customers that we talked to, their inventory carrying costs temporarily have gone up by 20 to 50%. Let's not forget, even coinciding with coronavirus is the Chinese holiday period. So as such, companies were ramping up inventory in anticipation of that. So these inventory carrying costs have gone up, but keep in mind, these inventories are being depleted as we speak, okay? So now let's switch the focus from inventory to logistics costs. Logistics costs have increased as well because some of the key components now they're having to ship by air. Right, as opposed to coming by the ocean. And because they are willing to take the additional cost hit on the logistics, otherwise the opportunity lost in terms of shutting down production lines is going to be highly penalizing. So Because of that, logistics costs have also spiked somewhere in the range of 20 to 40%. And even the sourcing costs have spiked in the similar range because now they are looking beyond their primary sources of supply and switching to secondary and tertiary of sources of supply, if you will. So the other factor to keep in mind as well is we have seen this in prior supply chain disruptions as well. As manufacturing activity recovers in China, customers will be put on allocation by the suppliers. The fact is they're not simply going to have as much as supply to meet all the demand that they can. So there will be some trade-offs that the Chinese suppliers will have to make, right? With those customers that establish themselves as preferred partners, they will have an edge in getting better allocations. So as such, there would be, expect there to be some negotiation, some ongoing dialogue between these customers and the Chinese suppliers so that the customers are looking to get a larger share of the allocated short supply, if you will, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, absolutely. So just to kind of recap those three areas that organizations are working through to respond. Many were saved by the Chinese holidays and having to build up an inventory buffer. However, the inventory carrying costs are going up. Logistics costs have increased simply because some pieces have to be expedited over air, which is tremendously more expensive than going through a ship. And then finally, as suppliers and as manufacturing starts to recover, that recovery won't necessarily be even. In some cases, the supply won't be there for everyone, or preferred partners may get preferential treatment from their suppliers. It doesn't necessarily paint the prettiest of pictures, and certainly it sounds like it could be a costly recovery as businesses start to work through the changes that have been pushed on by coronavirus. I guess it's worth asking, but is there anything good that's coming out of this disruption? What lessons can organizations learn? What would be your call to action?
So if there's one good thing that the current crisis is doing, Matt, I would say it is putting the focus on supply chain. Look no further, just turn on CNBC and just count how many times you hear the word supply chain being mentioned these days in the context of coronavirus crisis, right? So supply chain is becoming a top of mind issue for the CEO, given the current crisis. So the elevated focus certainly is one, if at all, it's putting supply chain in the spotlight. Now contrast that with over the years, how supply chains have traditionally been looked at. They've been traditionally looked at as a cost play, right? Anytime I need to squeeze costs out of my operations, I look up to supply chain. And in some sense, I look up to it as like an ATM machine, for lack of better words. So, however, what the current crisis is doing is elevating the role of supply chain to say that it's no longer about just cost play. Given the limited supply I'm having, what are the recovery mechanisms for the supply? Not because it's a cost play, but because I want to maximize my revenue potential and I want to maximize my service to my customers. So how can supply chain help me get there? So it's forcing more and more of these conversations that are happening in the C-suite. So I think that's a positive outcome as I see it.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean it's interesting, and I don't want to be too cynical here, but in the past decade, it seems that we've had a lot of wake-up calls as supply chains have become more global and more entrenched. Examples like the West Coast port strike in the U.S., Hurricane Harvey, the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, Rana Plaza, coronavirus, and even the trade war. All of these events have had an impact that is felt across many supply chains. Sometimes in isolated pieces of a supply chain or only affecting one industry. But increasingly, it seems with a high magnitude. And the more that people learn about the supply chain, the more attention seems to be focused on it. I guess for this particular one, knowing that this has caused the largest quarantine in human history, that finding a cure takes time, and it's very costly on a human level and on the business level. Um, what do you think makes this situation different? Will this spark more action, say, than other black swan type of events in the past?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I think one thing, if you were to look at it, is just the sheer magnitude of the impact, right? And it's no longer just concentrated around Wuhan. In general, the ripple effects are, as such, being felt across the globe. And there is a high degree of uncertainty in terms of where the end is in sight. But to address a bit of your cynicism as well, right? So let me share with you a somewhat of a counterpoint of view, if you will. What we are noticing with our customers is, let's take supply chain design as an example, right? Companies used to look at their supply chain, structural aspects of their supply chain, and how the product is flowing through the supply chains in a very periodic manner, maybe once a year, once in 2 years, just launch a project and make sure my supply chain is aligned correctly to serve my customers and whatnot. Even before coronavirus, and trade wars had something to do with that, as well as prior to trade wars, just the rise of rising consumer expectations as well had something to do with this, where companies are thinking that, hey, my supply chain strategy, the design and the policies that guide my supply chain should no longer be one and done exercises, should no longer be something I touch once in 2 years. But instead, I'm already seeing this trend towards organizations saying, do I need to be far more agile and far more dynamic in terms of designing and implementing my supply chain policies? Because the world around me is changing so fast. And as such, we are seeing that move towards more of this agile modeling of the supply chain policies and driving structural and flow related decisions far more frequently. So I only expect things like coronavirus now are accelerating, will serve as accelerants or impetus, if you will, towards that trend, towards more frequent revisiting of your supply chain policies and assumptions on which you're operating today. So that's something that's already happening, and I think the coronavirus impact would definitely accelerate that trend.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, and that is great perspective, that sometimes it does take a big event to elevate the conversation, to push the idea of supply chain not just being a cost center, but a very significant piece of the business. Understanding that while it's not easy, it may spark that new attention or increased attention on the impact of design and the ability to make fast decisions, to build greater agility when it comes to future challenges that we know may come and may be completely unexpected. Any additional takeaways or thoughts as we close out today's conversation?
I think there are some actions that organizations should be considering, Matt, in light of coronavirus. So this also brings to surface the need for investing in advanced analytics capability, especially something that is powered by the algorithmic intelligence with advanced algorithms like AI and whatnot, right? So analytics can certainly help organizations mitigate the effects of coronavirus impact in the near term. So let's talk about the how. It all begins with being able to get a basic handle on simple questions like, what part of my supply and how much of it is coming from China? What finished products is the supply going into? What alternate sources do I have to meet the demand? And when I look at these alternate sources, what options provide me with the least landed cost? But I don't want to make it sound like answering these questions is trivial. Most organizations struggle with even answering these simple questions, right? At the heart of the struggle is supply chains. If you think about them, deeply interconnected with many to many relationships between the sources of supply, manufacturing, distribution, and last mile delivery. And this is causing organizations to look into, especially the progressive ones that we are working with, they are consciously looking into building a digital twin of their physical supply chain, right? And if you think about it, at the heart of it, this is a big data challenge. But thanks to the rise in cloud computing and the advanced algorithms, answering these questions and driving decisions that balance minimizing costs and maximizing service is here and now. And if you look at some of the nimble organizations that we see in action with coronavirus and whatnot, they are turning off the nodes of their network, manufacturing facilities, distribution facilities, etc., in their digital twin, and they're simulating alternate flow paths to make sure they're maximizing the business continuity, right? So, but after all, it goes back to this. Those who react fast to disruptions like the coronavirus, they will have the first mover advantage in locking in the critical path part supply, right? Before their competition has the time to react. But if you take the focus away beyond the short term about coronavirus, organizations should also use the current crisis as an opportunity to leveraging technology, leveraging advanced algorithms to design their networks for the future, right? And accounting for the amount of risk exposure that they can take and how much resiliency they need to build in responding to that risk. And this just serves as a reminder that there is no substitute to preparedness when you are hit with crisis like this. So overall, I would say technology can play a major role in mitigating the impact from coronavirus, but in the long run, making the supply chain stronger and more resilient to such shocks to the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that seems like such a consistent theme. But in order to know what's possible, you need to have a very clear image of what you are today and what's happening across all of these systems and locations and processes in the supply chain. So your points on the digital twin and being able to assess those challenges, the impact, and make a fast decision certainly does seem like a massive advantage when it comes to situations like this.
Absolutely.
All right. Dr. Madhav Durbha, Group Vice President of Industry Strategy at LlamaSoft. Thank you again for joining Adapt or Die.
Thank you, Matt, for having me on the show.
Great. And for those of you that are listening, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to find us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast network.